a lot of times there is a pressure to really anchor on our capability and our logic and our reliability in order to be seen as useful in these circles. And a lot of us have sort of, really emphasized and anchored on that to the detriment or exclusion of really demonstrating the care that we want to demonstrate.
Hello and welcome to the Leadership Launchpad, where we help technical managers improve themselves, their teams, and their organizations. On this show, I talk with industry leaders, coaches, authors, and experts to give you actionable insights that help improve your own performance and the performance of those around you. Today's show is one of a series that I recorded at the recent Association for Talent Development International Conference. If the video looks a little bit weird or the audio isn't as clean as normal, I do apologize. This was actually my first time recording out in the wild. Don't worry, I learned a lot, and so next time it'll be better. Our guest today is Alexis Gonzales-Black. Alexis is a partner and the org design practice lead at August Public. She led an absolutely amazing discussion group at the conference, and I wanted to sit down and chat with her immediately after that discussion. In today's episode, you can expect to learn how to identify if your team has problems with trust, what the important elements of the trust equation are, how leaders can build trust on their teams, and so much more. Before we get into the discussion, I do want to remind you to subscribe if this is your first time watching or listening so that you never miss a future show. And if you are already subscribed, then I humbly ask that you share this show with at least one other person, because that, after all, is how we grow. With that, let's get into the discussion. On that note, Alexis, thank you so much for taking a minute to be on the Leadership Launchpad. You just finished a presentation, so you're probably a little tired, so thank you.
No worries. I'm happy to be here.
I'm really excited so I got to see your presentation, and it was really interesting because really early on, you asked the question of what are the major challenges that you're seeing for leaders and organizations.
Yes.
I answered that with trust. I think I didn't see trust come up by anybody else, but it was the number one thing on my mind. It's a big thing we focus on. And then when you started talking, you said you work with a lot of tech companies, and the number one thing you see is challenges with trust and transparency.
Yes. And I will say, even though trust didn't explicitly come up on the board when we asked, there were a lot of trust-related concerns. So there's a lot around engagement and ambiguity and all of the things that require trust in order to navigate were there. And even in the discussion, folks were saying, it's that sort of foundational issue. So even though it wasn't, the top of mind word for everybody, I saw all kinds of connections to trust in the work that we're doing around trust.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And so I'd be interested when you're working with companies, kind of on that same note, because I don't think trust is usually the thing that people see. How do you see it manifest itself in the organization? And then how do you help the organization kind of realize that trust is the underlying issue?
Yeah. Well, I gave in the session, I gave sort of two stories that are really concrete examples of where trust has been lost or compromised. And the examples are, pretty ubiquitous, and there's all kinds of companies out there who are suffering with the same thing. So the first one I gave is trust with customers. So looking externally, right? And that could be because of a data breach. It could be because of a misstep or some sort of PR move that didn't land well. But what happens when you lose trust with your customers? The other one is sort of trust internally. So especially as leaders who are navigating a really difficult and sometimes volatile economic situation, we've had layoffs or reducing headcount or telling people you have to deliver the same thing but with fewer resources. And so we have all kinds of situations now in this environment where you're compromising on the trust that you've built. And we often say that trust is gained in drops and lost in buckets. So one of those missteps could really pour out your whole trust bucket, and now you're starting from scratch and wondering, are my people looking for other jobs just because of this new policy or because of this reduction in force or whatever it is. So there's all kinds of examples of how folks are experiencing breaks in trust. And a lot of times we strategize around the symptom. So like retention.
Exactly.
People are leaving. How do we get people to stay?
We pay them more.
Exactly. And so we think about paying them more, we
Yeah.
think about and of course all that matters.
Sure.
But it also matters underneath all of that whether or not they believe what you say and whether or not they believe in this company and trust this company.
Yeah.
And so that can be sometimes something we overlook and we look towards more, compensation based or bonus based ways to incentivize people. So a lot of times we're dealing with the symptom, but going under what we see under a lot of these is a real lack of trust. And do you mind if I define it really
Please
quickly?
do, yes.
So the way that I think about trust is I think about it, the first two parts of trust, I think about care, right? Demonstrating care for somebody.
Yeah.
So I think about these, the 4 factors of trust.
Great.
Care, and then I think about authenticity or transparency. So those are kind of in the first bucket of like, what is my intention when I interact with you? Am I demonstrating care for you as a human being? And am I authentic and transparent? So can you, believe that I'm telling you the whole truth? Do you believe that I'm holding on to information, or am I being really transparent around my questions or my concerns? So that's kind of around the intention. And then on the other end, we've got reliability and capability, or sometimes I call it logic, which is like, I trust you to be capable to do your job. I trust that you're logical in the decisions that you're making. And then also reliable. I trust you to do what you say you're going to do. And that's more about performance. So there's like intention and performance. And those 4 things together, they act together in concert, right, to create trust. If any one of them is missing, it throws the whole trust equation off. Right. So if you care deeply, and a lot of managers are in this, in this boat where, they might care a lot, but it's not translating, it's not getting across. They're not demonstrating that care. So even if they're incredibly reliable, they're capable leaders, if their employees don't feel cared for, it completely breaks the trust that could exist. So we often think about it in those 4 factors, and we ask folks, where are you overemphasizing? Where are you really strong? And then which parts might you have, but maybe aren't displaying enough in order to build the trusting relationships that you want.
I love that. Yeah, I'm thinking a lot of times, especially when you're talking about layoffs and that kind of stuff, it can bring into such juxtaposition, like the values of a company, of what you say you stand for. And then in this moment, we're just going to fire everybody. And not, we're a family, but we're disposable.
You're summing up. That is the bottom line of so many of the layoffs that have happened, which are people are stunned. They're walking away from their companies. I heard this from somebody recently who said, you said we were a people-focused company, but the layoff was so inhuman. And it's not even laying off. I think people to a certain extent understand, the conditions in the case, but the way that the company goes through, are they demonstrating care in that transition? Are they demonstrating transparency to whatever extent they can? Are they demonstrating reliable, like you can rely on us to do what we say we're going to do? And are we demonstrating our logic and our capability, which is that we have the capacity to do this well? And a lot of companies are falling short.
It's really similar to the discussion that was happening a year or 2 ago on a lot of return to work policies. And that it wasn't necessarily the policy that people were mad about of having to return to work. They just didn't feel like they were asked. They didn't feel heard. They didn't know how it all happened. And so it was just thrust upon them.
Absolutely.
When you're dealing, so that's a lot at the higher organizational level. When you're dealing with, mid-level managers, frontline managers, of that kind of trust quadrant, do you see typical places where people are stronger or weaker? Is it kind of across the board?
I do see typical places. I think, something happens when, let's say you were an individual contributor and you were great at your job and you then cross over into a management position. There are a couple things that immediately become strained for folks. The first is that authenticity and transparency. They start asking themselves, how much can I share? How real can I be? There's a little bit of imposter syndrome sometimes, which is, can I be authentically who I am? Do I have to put on this air of like, I'm the boss now?
Because it's something that that's something that's almost taught in the popular culture of you have to have this different mask that you put on.
Of course, right? So that is, especially if we grew up in corporate environments, we've seen so many folks before us really change. And all of a sudden, access to information is, so we often see that kind of authenticity, transparency wobble is what we call it a wobble when you head into a leadership position. And then also, I think predictably, as you get higher into the organization, we see care sometimes as a wobble. And especially, and I'll bring this up, as a woman working in tech industries, a lot of times there is a pressure to really anchor on our capability and our logic and our reliability in order to be seen as useful in these circles.
Yeah.
And a lot of us have sort of, really emphasized and anchored on them to the detriment or exclusion of really demonstrating the care
Yes.
that we want to demonstrate. And so especially at the higher levels and especially for women, we see that folks tend to wobble around that care.
I can see that. Yeah. And I think it's also kind of like the end of a decades-long push of kind of taking like, the industrial era Taylorism and putting it into the white-collar sector or the technology sector of it's all about results. It's all about the work. And we just kind of suck a lot of the humanity out of it. And we don't spend enough time talking about how important it is to connect as individuals.
Absolutely.
In order to achieve the work.
Yes, and that's important to say because I think people think about it as, well, I'm trying to get the job done, but the reality is that unless you have strong trust on your team is not going to be effectively moving as a unit, right? Because there's going to be sabotage and back channeling and all of the things that happen in team cultures where there isn't high trust. And you're going to end up creating a lot more noise that actually blocks you from achieving the thing you're trying to do. So by using that transparency, by demonstrating that care, you can actually help your team work more effectively.
Exactly, I 100% agree. So it sounds like you've spent a lot of time working with kind of those new managers stepping up into roles, and you did a great job in your presentation of kind of clearly you have a lot of like clear frameworks and actions, for people to follow. I don't know, what's one thing that jumps into mind of if you're a new leader and you kind of sense that maybe trust is a challenge in your team, what's one or two things that you could try to do?
Yeah, I shared this today and it bears repeating because it's a good practice. So the way that we think about change is, beyond the framework, how do you actually practice leadership? Because leadership is a practice. And I think some of us have, for a long time thought it's maybe you have it or you don't. You're either a leader or you don't, that it's something that you're sort of innately born with. Or it's something, when you look at leaders who have grown up, they've just sort of picked up on implicit clues around how to be a leader here. And so the first thing I want to say is that I believe at August Public that leadership is a practice. It's something you do. It's something you do every day. And so the practice that I love, especially for new managers, one that I shared today is called candid comms. And so it's this idea of when you're sharing a communication, because all of a sudden you're going to be the conduit through which everything passes. And you're going to be torn, right? You're going to have situations where your job is both to protect your people and advocate for your people, but now you're also responsible for holding the whole picture of the organization and what's best for the business. And those two things, sometimes they create some natural and necessary tension and friction that you are now in the driver's seat of having to navigate. So when you communicate, especially around initiatives or programs or changes in policy, sometimes you'll get that sort of canned communication from your team. And as a manager, the way that you can help reinforce the trust on your team and help balance all those perspectives is by using what we call candid comms. So it's a 4-step sort of process. The first thing is that when you're communicating with your team, you're going to want to explicitly say up front what you're trying to achieve and set the context for people, because people are smart. They don't want to have to guess around the context. So you might say something like, given this economic environment, our business, in order to remain profitable, is trying to think of ways to save money. Obvious, but a lot of times we don't communicate the context. We just expect people to execute on it and they don't have the context. So understand first, set the stage for people. The first thing is what I can tell you. It means that we will no longer be hiring outside consultants and we're going to reduce our travel budget by X, Y, and Z. What I can't tell you, I don't yet know how this is going to impact our offsite coming up or the hire that we already have approved. I don't know. And naming what you don't know. Because people, if you don't name what you do know and what you don't know, they'll assume that you're holding things back from them.
Absolutely.
Right? So just say up front. And it's okay. I think a lot of new leaders struggle with this because, again, I don't want to be seen as somebody who doesn't know things. But you have to be strategic and actually give them some of that and let go of the idea that they're going to not respect you for it, because the opposite is actually true. People will respect you much more if you're really transparent about what you're sharing.
Well, and also it so often slows things down. I can't tell you how the number of times I've been in communication with executive leaders, and they're like, oh, we can't really say anything yet. And it's already kind of getting out through the networks in the company. People know something's happening, but you're just not saying anything because you don't have all the answers yet. It's like, well, people are already knowing and they're making up their own assumptions.
Okay, to extend that, the other thing that just drives me up a wall is when people say, oh, we don't want to create any unnecessary anxiety around this.
you're going in the wrong direction.
Right. And you're like, first and foremost,
Yes.
anxiety exists.
Yes.
These people are already chatting in
Yes.
back rooms
Yes.
and in DMs
Yes.
and in all the ways. The
Yes.
anxiety exists. So don't think that you're going to solve any problem by holding back
Yes.
more information
Yes.
from them. You won't.
Yeah.
In fact, you might be creating anxiety by the
Yeah.
lack of communication.
Yeah.
And also, this is my personal pet peeve with this, it's very patronizing to think that, oh, they can't handle this
Yes.
information.
Yes.
And so I'm going to be very, strategic about how I'm approaching this.
Yeah.
And I think we can expect more of our employees. They're adults who make decisions in their everyday life all the time. They understand difficult decisions need to be made, and I think we need to treat them as adults. And part of that is communicating. So I mentioned, the first steps, which is like framing up the context, sharing what you do know, what you don't know, and then naming the very next step. And I always say the very next step because I think people will sometimes wait until the whole plan
Same thing.
is articulated.
Yes.
They'll wait for the whole roadmap and everything has been approved. That's not going to happen, my friend. You need to be communicating sooner than that.
Yeah.
And so you can say, our very next action is to do X and focus on the next step, even if it's not all baked.
Yeah.
And that practice, that 4-step practice can really
that.
help new leaders contextualize information in a way for their teams that is super effective and helps them build trust.
And I think one thing to point out that I know you mean is like that's something that can happen at every level of leadership.
100%.
And even if you're at the very bottom, and some of the examples that you gave are for bigger picture initiatives. If we're not hiring anybody else in this department, or we're laying these off or whatever. As a manager, I think it is your role. I remember leadership training I went to years and years and years ago. They had the catchphrase of managers are not communicated to, they're communicated through. And I think so your job as a manager is when you receive something from above you, you can apply this framework, which is amazing. And chances are, in a lot of organizations, you're going to see holes. And that's your opportunity to be the manager, to be the leader and say, okay, I'm going to go find out what this information is. I'm going to ask a quick question, not waiting too long, but try to fill in these gaps.
So that you're giving a complete picture.
Exactly.
And you're also building partnership with your team in that moment, saying like, you're with us on this journey. And it's not all thought out because the moment when leaders try to pass themselves off as all-knowing, that's when we get into sticky situations where you can't keep that up but for so long. When things are changing, you're gonna have to admit at some point, look, the future is not totally clear. You're gonna have to stick with me here. We're gonna have to learn together. And I think you inspire that by that kind of reliable cadence of communication that feels really transparent and really human. You're bringing them along for that journey.
One of the things I want to bring forward from your presentation kind of related to this, because I think this is such an excellent framework and it would really help, especially new managers, just think about it, is just, as you said, it's a practice. Leadership is a practice. Practice takes practice. And to not expect that you're going to get this right away. And to be realistic about it. You might need to have this on a sticky note on your
100%.
Screen for months before it becomes normal. And that's okay. You're trying to hone in on this one skill, practice it for however long it takes.
Absolutely. And another thing that can help is, again, sharing with your team what you're trying to do. Like, create accountability for yourself and say, look, your next team sync or huddle, say, I realize there's a lot coming through right now, and I'm going to try this approach of candid comms where I'm sharing more context with you. I'm sharing what we do know and don't know. And here's the practice. If any of you see me skipping over this, I want to give you all permission to hold me to this, raise your hand, nudge me, poke me, and say, look, you promised you'd share X, X, and X. And so, again, enlist your team to help you. They want you to be a good leader. Right? For their own sake. So that's another great trick.
For any leaders watching, listening, if you're going through any kind of training, you're reading a book, you're doing self-study, whatever it is, I couldn't recommend that more because it can be, I know I've made this mistake as a new leader of you think about, you read a book and you're like, oh, this is a great idea. And you just go in and you start doing all these things. And a lot of these things, a lot of these frameworks, the one that always comes to mind is when you're learning how to do active listening. And they always say, so after somebody says something, what do you say? You say, so what I hear you saying is, and that's really awkward. But that's the point. It's meant to be a drill that gets you closer to a new type of behavior.
That's right.
And so it's not meant that you're going to say that forever, but it's a crutch to help you get there. But if you don't prep your team ahead of time to expect this, it's going to seem really weird.
What's wrong with Matt?
Yeah, exactly.
He's acting like an alien.
I think that's fantastic. Awesome.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit more about your group, what you
Yeah, so August Public is an org design and development firm. We are focused on helping leaders transform the way that their teams and organizations work. And like I've said a few times here, we really focus on practices, everyday practices. And so this is beyond the workshop, beyond the training or the learning moment or the moment that you read a book and you think to yourself, like, isn't this cool? I've got this incredible idea. How do you actually translate that into everyday habit and practice?
Better every day.
You get better every day. Look at this. Okay, so a lot of people stop there. They introduce the framework, they have a binder on their desk, and it kind of gathers, dust over time, and we never do it. And so August is really focused on working with leaders to, embed deeply with organizations to figure out how do you shift those everyday practices down to the we really think about it like the atomic unit of change, right? These tiny little phrases,
simple actions.
Simple actions. And I said this in the session that we just did, but there's simple even phrases to use because if you want to change the way people behave, you have to change the way that we talk, right? And so, for example, at the end of the meeting, we have so many leaders who are struggling with decision making and slow, consensus seeking behaviors. And yet at the end of every meeting, they're saying, okay, do we all agree on this? Do we all feel comfortable with this? And we offer to folks one simple phrase change, which is instead of saying, do we all agree with this? Ask, okay, is this safe enough to try knowing that we'll revisit it next quarter? Is it safe enough to try knowing that little phrase changes? And if you can do that, you can shift the whole bar for decision making in the organization. You go from asking people, do I feel comfortable, which is a lot, right? How many people are truly comfortable with any change that happens?
And they're like so far from, they're still not going to raise their hand because there's just so many questions that come up.
That's right. And that's when you get that sort of, again, the decision after the decision. So you leave the meeting thinking you're all aligned, but then everybody's like, I really am not comfortable with this. Unfortunately, that's not the bar now. The bar is this safe to try? So, we try to implement these daily practices at August that really help people shift. And sometimes that comes, at the very top in sort of learning and developing champions, or it comes to coaching, or it comes to sitting in those meetings. For teams that are really stuck in these sort of like calcified old ways of working, sitting with them and coaching them and facilitating those moments to help shift daily behavior to change the way your teams work. So my firm August does that, and I think that's really the only way that deep, lasting, sustainable change happens is like in the flow of work with the people in those daily habits.
Absolutely. Well, this has been absolutely fantastic. Yes. I'm really glad you were able to. You really brought a lot of energy, and this is amazing given all the energy that you just poured into that presentation.
Dancing around on stage,
So thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Great.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
All right.
Thank you so much for listening to today's show. If you are looking for help turning your organization's great engineers into great managers, me and my team at Better Everyday Studios would love to help. We deliver targeted and interactive training workshops that are designed to help build the 3 fundamental skills of any new manager: building trust, giving feedback, and setting goals. Reach out to me through Matt at bettereverydaystudios.com so we can start making your organization better every day.